I have my binoculars here ready, and I am sitting looking out of the window like this. I don't know if you can see the sea there, but
Yes.
those of you that were observant will have seen a gannet fly by there. And so anyway, I'm ready, and I might get distracted because I might add something to my garden as I talk to you. Um, anyway, thank you very much for inviting. Quite a few of you already, but I will crack on. Um, Now we're a small, relatively small group, and those of you that know me know that I don't mind at all, and I don't. You don't need to stand on ceremony. If you want to ask me anything, you can type it in the chat, or you can interrupt me. I don't mind. We can do it at the end. We can do it during. Um, we can get a discussion going. I don't. I mean, I've got a lot of stuff to tell you about, but I don't want to bore you. So if you're feeling that you're getting a bit bored, get in there, get that question, and everyone will appreciate it, I'm sure. So I'll share my screen. Thank you. Okay. Um, Now I'm preaching to the choir. You know a lot about this, don't you? Already. African birds that are also partly European. Now, we Europeans like to think of these migrant birds as European birds, but actually they're African birds. And if we look at this sort of phenology diagram for wind chats, you can see they're spending over half of their time in Africa, and then a large chunk of their time is migration. And their breeding time that they spend in Europe when we regard them as European is only 17%. And that's not particularly atypical. I mean, it's just basically May to the end of August that these birds are with us. The rest of the time, they're in Africa. And some birds, like cuckoos, it's even shorter time that they're with us. So there are various questions that we might ask about these African birds that spend time in Europe. And a really key one is, where are they in Africa I mean, we know they go to Europe, but are there any particular parts of Africa in which they occur? And actually, it's quite striking. So if you look at that hotspot diagram, top left, you've got where it's dark red, you've got more species of these migrants, African European birds than not. And you see the cold spots are, for example, Congo Basin, you can see the whole of southern West Africa. There's much, much low density. And the real concentration are in the sub-Saharan countries, so including Nigeria. And see there's that lovely band going across, but with really high densities in places like Sudan, South Sudan. Now, it's really interesting when you start thinking and asking this question, where are the birds? Because here's like your classic distribution map. This is from Handbook of Birds of the World. And you see that big yellow swathe where they're breeding in Europe across Central Asia. And then you've got the blue area, which is the wintering grounds in Africa. And that looks really kind of straightforward, except it's actually not, because those of you, and I guess it's all of you that are collecting bird records and doing atlases, that atlases are very dynamic, and you get records of birds here sometimes, and then you don't get them at another time. And of course, if you lay all those records on each other, you end up with this lovely distribution map. But actually, this distribution map is kind of like an average, or if you like accumulated average, it's not actually what's happening at any one time. It's actually much more patchy. So if we drill down into, say, white throat distribution, that was the map that we had on last. And these are all the places that I've been to, um, pretty much in Nigeria, and where I've looked for whitethroats. And some areas you don't find them, other areas you do. Now, at this scale, this broadly looks like the distribution map. You've got them in the north of Nigeria, but you haven't got them in the south of Nigeria. But as you drill into these places, so if we go into area between Nguru and Lake Chad in northern Nigeria, you can see that you're beginning to pick out that, yes, there are whitethroats here, but they're not everywhere. And if we drill in to a smaller area and you start at the scale of individual point counts, you find that, and this is all within suitable whitethroat habitat, you find some areas where you have whitethroats, some points where you don't have whitethroats. So the idea that there's this blanket distribution, that they occur all over within that blue range within Africa is just not true. And of course, us as ornithologists, we know that's not true. But then again, we kind of act like it is true. And that creates all sorts of, if you like, misunderstandings, I think, and barriers to understanding how the ecology of these birds work. So let's look at some typical habitats for these European African migrant birds. And the thing that really characterizes the habitats for me is that they're very kind of average in the sense that you can find, this is, most of you will know, this is a view looking out of the back of Amaranth Forest, where Ablori is situated. And you've got savanna, which hasn't been converted to agriculture. And then behind it, you have got savanna, Guinea savanna, which has been converted to agriculture. But basically, you've got a few trees kicking around. You've got lots of bushes and scattered grass. And then on the left-hand side, you can see retained gallery forest along the watercourse. Now, this is all over Africa. You will find this kind of pattern, these habitats. And this is where you find of the European African migrants. So they're not very fussy. This habitat, this is more in the north of Nigeria. This is acacia woodland up near Nguru. And when I show this slide to Europeans, I try and point out the similarities to the habitats that we have in Europe. And actually, we have a species of tree called a hawthorn, similar another species called a blackthorn. They're not acacias, but when they lose their leaves in winter, they look very much like this. And when they have their leaves on in the summer, this is the kind of place you would find whitethroats. So the whitethroats, other European species, are kind of using the same general, widely distributed habitat, both in Europe and both in Africa. And one thing that really characterizes the European African birds is that they're often very happy in human modified habitats. Things like farmland. So here's a piece of farmland outside Amarim, got a yellow wagtail inset, I've just caught that in this place. But other species you might find here, red-throated pipit, if you're lucky, you've got tree pipit, you've got woodchat shrike on occasions, you've got whitethroats, you've got yellow wagtails, you've got woodchats, a whole range of species. Wrynecks, for example. And when you're trying to find the highest densities of some of these African European species, you find them in farmland. And the highest densities that I can find windchats in Africa is in really intensive tomato fields around Ablori, for example. So the migrants occur all over the place in Africa, but they don't occur everywhere. Yet their habitat requirements on the face of it are actually really general. They don't really require very much specialized. So what actually do they need? So we need to do some more intensive work that some of you will recognize Ulf, obviously, hard at work. He's got his gin bottle there, so he's happy. What we're doing is catching birds. Once you catch birds, you can put rings on them, and then you can start looking at birds as individuals, and you can ask very specific questions. So I can say, okay, I've got colorings on this wind chat, release the wind chat, and now I can see what habitats it uses and which ones it doesn't. So let's ask this question on northern wheatears. So here we are right up next to the Niger border in Nigeria, back in the days when somebody like myself will be able to go up there and not be killed. It's a lovely environment. Here we've got a whole load of northern wheatears that we've caught with spring traps or in mist nets, and we put colorings on. Let's look at the scale, 300 meters. Let's zoom in at 100 meters. Inset, you've got an idea of what the habitat looks like. And you can join up individual resightings of the coloring birds and look at territory size. But look at the size of the territory. They're really tiny. So these birds are sped northern wheatears that may migrate 15,000 kilometers. Huge distance. They may go from Greenland all the way down to Nigeria. But then once they get there, the scale at which they operate is tiny. It's like 50 meters. So how general is this? So here's Mohammed, one of the earliest in one of the earliest cohorts of students at Ablori, and Mohammed's living the dream. He's radio tracking our whitethroats, trying to answer the question of how much space do they use. Mohammed learned the hard way that yeah, fieldwork doesn't always quite go as you planned. Not because his scientific work wasn't successful. It's just that the whitethroats really were a little bit dull. So remember, Ulf, he's caught the whitethroat. We've put a ring on it and a radio transmitter, and then Mohammed's tracking it. So it's trapped here, it's released, and then it goes off to a bush. And then Mohammed comes out every day and records its location, and it's in the bush, and it's in the bush, and it's in the bush. You see what I mean? It all seems so glamorous to be out tracking wildlife, but actually, if your whitethroat's staying in the same bush, that's not very exciting. But this guy was like a world traveler compared to this other whitethroat. So trap and release site, look at the scale here. It spent its entire time in one bush, sufficiently so that Mohammed thought it was dead. He'd go out there every day, get a signal, and it looked like it hadn't moved. But one day it moved. It moved to another bush. There we go. And Mohammed was really excited about it. And he ran up to the lecture theatre at Laurie and said, it's moved, it's moved. And so we all got excited, and the whole class and me ran out to see the whitethroat that had moved. But unfortunately, by the time we got there, it had already gone back to its original bush. So there you are. So these whitethroats, the wheatears as well, and in fact, a lot of species only use very small bits of Africa. They might travel a long way to get here. Once they get here, they're not moving around much. Now, what about the actual habitats that they're using? What do they need when they're there? Now, if a whitethroat's not moving from a bush, it kind of implies that it doesn't need very much. It only has to move over a very small space, and these bushes aren't particularly exceptional. And when you start looking at how whitethroat densities change at sites as how habitats change. So we do this by doing point counts and then coming back maybe 2 or 3 years later and doing point counts in exactly the same place. And in the meantime, the trees have either got bigger or they've been cut down. So you get changes in vegetation, which is what's on the y-axis here. And you record the whitethroats both times, so you can record the change in whitethroats. Sometimes more whitethroats, sometimes fewer whitethroats. So that's the x-axis there. And you plot this over a large number of points. You can see we've got a large number of points there. And you do find a significant relationship. So as the density, as the vegetation gets a bit better, you find more whitethroats. But look at the slope. It's very, very shallow. And that's really interesting because what it tells us is that you can do an awful lot to the vegetation you can change it by, 60, 70 bushes within that point count. And you've still got whitethroats. Okay, you've got slightly fewer, but they're kind of doing okay. So it suggests that they're not very, very, you know, they obviously all animals need whatever fulfills their ecological niche, but whitethroats aren't particularly fussy, or they don't need very much. So this general question, what does a migrant, what does a European African bird need in its territory when it's in Africa? So back to wind chats here, and we've looked at a whole range of things here, and nothing makes a difference except in the case of these wind chats around in farmland around Ablori. If there's maize, you have higher densities of wind chats, and if there's greater shrub density, then you have smaller territories. So they like to have bushes in their territories or maize. Maize kind of functions in the same way as bushes. It provides perch and it provides a bit of cover to sort of make the habitat a little more than two-dimensional. But other more complicated things don't seem to make any difference. And when you really take this down to its basic level, what wind chats need in their territory more than anything are perches. So you can put them in a field, any field of stuff. It doesn't matter what the crop is, what state it's at. Perhaps you won't find wind chats there because there are no perches. But the moment you put a few bushes in there, the wind chats have perches, or you put some perches in there, and then the wind chats will appear. So they're kind of ready to go in any habitat, but they're just like, what wind chats are like. They're just like a little viewpoint of the ground so they can fly down, pick up the insect, and then fly back to the perch again. So what I'm trying to sell to you is that wind chats, they're not very specialized. They're not fussy. So let's ask this question generally. Are migrants fussy generally? Are the African European species? This is work that Sam Ivandi and I did quite a while ago, another Atlori student. And let me just explain this diagram. If you plot the density of a species on the y-axis, the y-axis, against some kind of habitat characteristic, so the bottom axis, the x-axis, if it's a generalist species, you find that you get an even density over a wide range of habitat characteristics. So not many bushes, lots of bushes, you still find lots of whitethroats, would suggest they're not specialists. But if you only found whitethroats at a particular bush density, and that's when you found a high density, that would suggest that's what they really liked. So narrow high peak, specialist species, and a low, if you like, wide peak, generalist species. So when you plot these kind of diagrams for things like wind chats, you find they've got peaks, but they're kind of low peaks. So we have a problem as a scientist by saying, yeah, okay, it looks like they're generalists, but maybe you could argue they're specialists, because how peaky do you need to be before we call you a specialist, or how flat do you need to be before we call you a generalist? So scientifically, what we need here is a control. So what we did is we plotted kind of diagrams and compared the European African migrant birds with African species that go everywhere. Doesn't matter what habitat you go in, and you'll find a tawny flank prinia. Tawny flank prinias everywhere, high density, all over Africa. They cannot be fussy. It's not like looking for, something like Bannerman's weevil, which only occurs in one little mountain in one part of Africa. We'd say that would be quite specialist. So we identified 17 Afrotropical residents that are very general in occurrence, occur across as wide a range of habitats as possible, and have the widest distribution across Africa as possible. Super generalists. And then we compared the two diagrams. So we're looking at habitat quality. you've got migrants and residents. So migrants are red in here and residents are the bluey green. We've got exactly the same for habitat quality. There's no statistical difference between those peaks. For habitat disturbance, characteristics of habitats, things like they're being burned or they're being farmed or they're being built on, degraded by humans, tolerance for the migrants and the super generalists. And when you look at habitat location, i.e. the spread, the latitudinal spread, you then find that migrants are even more generalist than the African super generalists. So however you stack it up, the super generalists in Africa are the migrants are just as generalist or are even more generalist. So when we're thinking about super generalists, we are thinking about the migrants that move between Africa and Europe. See in your mind, perhaps this is really what characterizes migrants, is that they have to be super generalists. Or if you are a super generalist, you can migrate. That kind of makes sense because you're going to be encountering all sorts of stuff if you're a migrant. So it's really not a good idea to be fussy. So here's another dimension of this kind of argument that the migrants are really not very fussy. They're super generalists. So back to wind chats, and this rather lovely diagram shows individual color-ringed wind chats, their individual locations plotted on a bit of habitat on Amarim, at Amarim. And the central location of each of these individuals' records for a winter is plotted, and then we've drawn a circle around it to correspond to the average range of all those points. So, of course, their territories aren't circular, but this gives you a rough idea of the distribution of these different birds. And that's not every wind chat in the population, but that's quite a few of them. And you can see they've roughly got non-overlapping territories. So this is March 2012. Look at the scale, 100 meters. So the territories are small, like the wheatears I talked about earlier. October. So they've migrated in April and they've come back in September. Now, the red circles are those territories which have stayed the same. Now, let's put this another way. So this is the winter ranges, just showing them before they migrate. So this is season 2, and this is in the following winter as well, color-coded according to the same individual. So if a wind chat comes back, it comes back to exactly the same place. Exactly the same perch, same set of perches. And any kind of difference between the two as well, just measurement error. So to put that all on one diagram, this shows the change in distribution of the wind chats that returned in the second winter. Those are the filled circles, and you can see they don't move. That's what I've said already. But look at the empty circles. Those were the wind chats that didn't come back. And half of the wind chats don't make it back because migration, the actual act of migration, is pretty dangerous. But what then is really interesting is these wind chats that have migrated 7,000 kilometers to Europe and back and have come back to exactly the same place. Why have they come back to exactly the same place? Because there's a 50% chance their neighbor's dead. And if their neighbor's dead, there's an empty territory. So what's the chance that their territory is worse than their neighbor's territory? On average, some of those territories, those empty territories, should be better. So why don't they move? Come on, you've come 7,000 kilometers. What's your problem in moving 100 meters next door? But they don't. They so don't. So in a wind chat's head, they're just thinking, that's fine. I'm happy where I am. I've got my perch. I've got my bush. That's fine. Don't bother me with any kind of extra moving of territory because I have enough And actually, if a windchat's having a bad day in Africa, it feeds until maybe 8:30, 9 o'clock in the morning instead of finishing at 8 o'clock. They've got loads of time. Temperature's fantastic. They don't have to raise chicks or anything. So they don't need very much. And I think this is very strong evidence that they're not worried. They're very relaxed once they get to Africa. But bear in mind, of course, that these territories are changing through the dry season. So they come back in September, they leave in end of March, beginning of April. And in the intervening time, it's changed from green to really quite shabby, dry, and scrubby. Yet they stay in the same place. So again, it implies that they don't need very much. The less food that there is in March is still sufficient for them. So on to another big question for migrants. How do they get there and how do they get back? Well, we need to put some tags on birds. This is an African migrant, the Cyprus wheat here. This one breeds entirely in Cyprus and it winters in Eritrea, South Sudan. And we put geolocators on these in Cyprus because I hypothesize that Cyprus, being right in the southern part of Europe, with the Mediterranean immediately there, and then the desert, the strip of vegetation is particularly thin along the Mediterranean in Egypt. Of course, you've got the Nile, but we hypothesize that the Cyprus wheat would fly directly from Cyprus to they cross the Sahara in a single flight, and that's exactly what we found. That they would be doing that they were doing on average 2,500 kilometers in about 50.4 hours, which is 42.1 kilometers an hour. And if you put these birds in a wind tunnel and you increase the fan speed and they're flying and they're flying, and at some point the fan speed's too fast, the birds start going backwards, you know that's their maximum speed. And it's about 42 kilometers an hour. So they're flying as fast as they can, crossing the Mediterranean and the Sahara in a single flight. So a range of 2,500 kilometers, is this typical? So like we need to tag some more migrants. So we're now putting geolocators on wind chats. I won't bore you with how geolocators work because I'm sure all of you know pretty much how they work. They're recording light, sunrise, sunset. From that, with a clock, you can work out where you are on the planet. Problem with geolocators, of course, is they're archival. They record this stuff, but they don't send it anywhere. So you've got to catch the bird, put the tag on, and you've got to catch it again 1 year later. So you need a crack team of people to help you locate them. Is part of my crack team. We're looking for wind chats. We found a wind chat. We think it's got its geolocator on. We've now got to catch it. Unfortunately, you can see this wind chat is like looking at something. It's looking at a mist net and it's thinking, I remember that from last year. I didn't have any fun in the mist net last year. I don't think I'm going to fly into it this year. So we're having a problem recatching these birds. And some wind chats, and I have this photo framed massively above my desk in St Andrews. Some wind chats I've never been able to recatch. This one in particular I took literally days trying to catch this bird, and it never even came close. And it's there laughing at me, basically. I did catch this, which was a consolation prize. So white-faced scops out. And did you know that they have blue eyeshadow? Do you see that? I didn't realize that. I didn't catch the wind chat, even though I'd stayed up nearly all night to catch it. I did catch the owl. And they got these fantastic violety blue eyelids, which is really incredible when you think it's an owl. So it's in a tree at night, fluttering its lovely violet eyelids at you or at another owl. And the owl's going, why are you fluttering your eyelids at me? It's dark. So there you are. Evolution acts very strangely. Still, sooner or later, we manage to catch the windchat. The really sensible thing to do is to catch them first in mist nets. They go off mist nets and catch them a year later in spring traps. Uh, if you do it in spring trap first, you'll never catch them again in the spring trap, and it's harder to get them in mist nets. Best to do your mist netting first when you're not bothered about what you catch, and then use the spring trap a year later when you are bothered and you can be more targeted. Anyway, we've caught the windchat. It's got its geolocator on. I'm really happy. I'm cutting it off. Yeah, it's intact. The bird is okay. It's a little bit of wear on the back because you can imagine the geolocators rub on their back, so they lose a few feathers. But apart from that, they look fine. And now I'm back at base at Lorry. This is the definition of a happy piece of field work. There's my computer, and you can see it's got lots of little numbers on it. So I'm downloading the tag, and because some of these tags you get back the batteries failed, they failed entirely, so you don't get any data. All that effort and you've got nothing. But here I am downloading it. I know I'm going to find the story, and best of all, I've got a donut. So life's good. This is what you get from geolocators. You get the red and blue traces are sunrise and sunset, and that varies according to the time of year and where the bird is. And when you get a sudden change in sunrise and sunset, as illustrated with the grey areas on the left-hand one, so you've got two on either side, sudden rapid change, it must be migrating. Because if suddenly the sunrise has shifted from 6 in the morning to 8 o'clock in the morning, it has to have gone east. Or west. East, yeah. You do the maths and you can work out where it's gone on the planet. So the geolocator on the trace on the left translates to that journey on the right. And you tag loads of birds in different places, and you end up with all these journeys of windchats, for example, where they start from, their stopping points, where they end up. Now, geolocators, as you know, they're a bit inaccurate, but on the scale of 6,000 kilometers, doesn't matter. And each of these tracks that you get just shows how incredibly flexible and how incredibly adaptive these to migration that these birds are. So here's an example of a bird that crosses Sahara 17th of April and arrives the 1st of May. So that's 2 weeks for it to go from Apaluri here all the way to pretty much Moscow. And you can see the stopping points along the way. And they're just amazing. This isn't the windchat, but it might as well be. This is one from a sub-Saharan stopover site in South Central African Republic to its breeding site in Moscow, 5,054 kilometers, did it in just 7 days. So from sub-Saharan Africa to basically pretty far north in Europe in just a week. It had no major stopovers. It was traveling about 30 kilometers an hour on average. Now they don't. They fly at, as I've said, 42 kilometers an hour or so. So that means they fly and then they stop for some point during the day. And you can work out from that speed that they've got about 7 hours per day when they're not traveling. And that's about 60% of daylight hours at that time of year. So they've got over half of the day every day to have a rest, to feed, ready for their next night's migration. So it's entirely possible. In fact, it's not only just possible, it's actually not such a big deal if the windchat has the sites to stop over at. And we'll revisit this later because this is the key to understanding migrants. Okay, so I've talked about their generalism, habitats they use. I've talked about how they can ace this migration. Now let's talk about connectivity. The question of, for example, if I tag whitethroats in Nigeria, where do they go in Europe? Or from the European point of view, if I have a population of whitethroats breeding around my house in Scotland, which part of Africa do they go to? So this is migratory connectivity, and it's a big deal to understand because if you want to conserve Nigerian whitethroats, you really would like to know where they go in Europe, because then you could hassle, say, for example, the Russians. Yeah, good luck with that, to look after their whitethroats. Now, I've tracked a few species, but what we really want to do is to ask really general questions. So we need lots of species tracked. So here we go. These are all the tracks I could find up to July 2019 for landbirds, 101 landbird species, 1,800 tracks, 127 tracking studies, a whole range of species all over the planet. And these are all the lines are just their starts and their finishes plotted. That's really quite beautiful, but you get an idea that we're talking about the planetary migratory system rather than just wind chats. Right, let's cut to the chase. Connectivity is mostly to do with geography. As my grandmother said very eloquently, birds fly south for the winter. Yep, that's more or less what they do. So let's make this point. Look at where migrants winter in the Americas. They winter in Central America, northern part of South America. Do you see how much land there is there? Now, if we put that in Africa, you can see there's almost no space. Yet all the American migrants, that's where they're going. And the landmass in North America is larger than the European landmass. So there are more migrants going to a smaller space. Whereas in Europe, you've got a smaller land area and they've got a bigger space to go to. They've got very, very big space to go to. And if you look at how the migrants spread out and use the space, you can predict a large chunk of their spread entirely by the availability of land. So geography accounts for 38% of where or how widely these migrant species spread out between the Americas and Europe and Africa. Whereas the individual species identity only accounts for 25% of the variation, which is quite amazing because we're comparing swifts, cuckoos, bee-eaters, honey buzzards, windchats, willow warblers, really quite diverse bird species. And actually, what determines, if you like, where they spread out and end up in Africa is just availability of land rather than their particular ecological niches. But then again, remember, they're generalists. So perhaps this idea of specialism in different parts of Africa being special doesn't matter to them. So just looking at this in a little more detail, this is migration spread in terms of migration distance. And you find this really interesting humpback relationship. And you think, oh, why are they doing that? Why are birds spreading out more if they migrate at intermediate distances? But think about the planet and think about the availability of land. And here's the map. And if I rotate that, what do you see? Humpbacks. So intermediate distant migrants can spread out because there's a lot of land available. That's that big bulgy bit of Africa and the big bulgy bit of South America. But as you move to the end of Africa, it gets narrower. So they can't spread out that much. And the same for South America. So that's why you get this humpback shape. Geography. It's nothing more complicated than they're just flying south. And then what we observe is because of the constraints of the environment, the geographical environment. Now, if I look at how birds spread out, so I've tagged them in Europe, a few birds, and then I've seen how widely spaced apart they end up in Africa. And I've looked at the average spacing. So if birds don't spread out much, stay pretty tightly together, then you'll get a small value of migration spread. But if they spread out all over Africa, you'll end up with a big value. So here are all the observed values. Now you see there's a lot of variation, but that's because we've got variable migration distances. And as you saw that humpback relationship, distance determines spread because of availability of geography, because of geography mostly. And also sample size makes a difference. If you've got a small number of birds tagged, you don't get such a big spread as if you've got lots of them. So if we statistically adjust for that, which is the left hand, So we've got a whole range of species, all those 101 or so species. And then we rearrange them according to order. We find some species don't spread out very much, like ortolan buntings. I mean, they still spread out 600 kilometers on average between any two individuals you might tag from the same population. Some species really spread out huge amounts. Ospreys, barn swallows, for example. This is near 1,500 kilometers. Right. But look, most species actually spread out quite a lot and to the same degree. So remember, there was no real species signal, no strong species signal for how things spread out. This is another way of showing it. Got a whole load of things with like Egyptian vulture in there, got Western kingbird, American species, we've got purple martin, a swallow, we've got redback shrike. They're all spreading out in the same kind of way. You've got some super spreaders and some very specialist species like ortolan bunting, but generally this kind of general similarity is maintained. So why spread out? Surely it makes sense to fly to a particular bit of Africa that might be the best bit. Even these wind chats that couldn't be asked moving 100 meters, it really should be evolutionary better for them to always go to the best habitat. We know this is how evolution works. Well, the reason is that you can't really predict where Africa is going to be good. Climate change, we all know it's a bad thing, but climate change is Africa. Africa has a huge amount of climate change as business as usual. So this is a graph I found in a paper in 2005, and I read the paper, and it's a brilliant paper. It predicts climate in the Sahel very well. It models climate very well in the Sahel, and so it predicts in the future, and basically there's going to be a massive drought and everything's going to die. You read this paper and you think, oh, so sad. And you feel very sad. But then next year, I read this paper, and it's a great paper. It predicts what's happens, models what's happening in the Sahel very well, climate, but then predicts in the future that it's going to rain, and it's lovely. And this really cheered me up. And if you read loads of these papers, or even read this one that summarizes them, and average all of these papers, actually, we've got no idea, because half the papers say things are going to get better and half say it's going to get worse. This is the best climate model you can have. Okay, things have got a little bit better, but the uncertainty within the Sahel still remains. So us, with all our supercomputers and our ever so clever approach to the world and our huge brains, we cannot tell you whether it's going to rain or not in the Sahel. So how on earth does a wind chart know? And if you look at variation on a decadal basis in Africa, and some of you, I know, have seen these slides before. They're some of my favorite ones. It's raining where there are where there are black circles, filled circles, and where it's open circles, it's not raining. So you can see there's lots of rain in the Sahel, 1950 to 1959, and down in places like Angola and Namibia in Southwest Africa. 10 years on, look what's happened. Drought now in Angola and Namibia, and much less rainfall in West Africa. Loads of rainfall in East Africa. Move 10 years on, oh, no more drought down in Southwest Africa. It's really raining, but we've got a drought going on in West Africa. East Africa, kind of normal. Move another decade, another shift again. Now, I've been alive 1, 2, 3. And it's been a few decades since then have happened. And there's that much variation that's happened in Africa in terms of rainfall. So where do you go if you're a migrant? Because it was good to go to this part of West Africa in the 60s, and it's not now. And it'll change in 10 years' time because the rainfall changes. So the best thing you can do is to hedge your bets. So if you are breeding in Europe and you have 5 white-throat chicks, best if they kind of go on a quite widespread course. One goes here, one goes here, one goes there, so that some of them hit the target. So suppose the shaded area at the bottom of the graph, bottom of the diagram is where they need to be. Some of your offspring get to it on a sort of scattergun approach. And if that shifts, some of them still get there. So it's a really good adaptation to climate change. But of course, once you've arrived at the target as a young bird, you don't know any better. You don't know where to go in Africa, so you might any direction's as good as any other. But if you arrive in a place like Amarim in central Nigeria and it's good, then you really should next year go back to that same place. Because sure, there's climate change, but not year to year to the same degree. You didn't have any knowledge, just hit and hope. But once you have knowledge, repeat, go back. So that's how the contradiction is resolved between this kind of random stuff. You as a parent, you want your chicks to go random, but you as a chick, after you've gone random and found something that works, then go specific. But of course, when you have chicks, you want them to go random. So evolution is acting to keep a big spread in the presence of climate change. And migration is an adaptation to climate change. But what I've been talking about is that these migrants are brilliant. They have massive amounts of resilience and adaptability. They're super generalists. They ace these migrations. They've got this fantastically adaptive migration strategy so that despite huge amounts of climate change, they still find viable routes. But these species are declining. They're massively declining. And when you compare resident European species and African European migrants, you find that the resident species in Europe, are not doing brilliantly, but they're kind of here. But the Africans are declining. Why? I've just told you that migrants are the best thing since sliced bread. Well, the problem is they're between a rock and a hard place. Spread is bet hedging, is a very poor adaptation to habitat loss. It's a great adaptation to climate change, but not to habitat loss. So if we do this Mickey Mouse diagram again, there's the target. And instead of the target shifting, the target is now decreasing. And you see an increasing proportion of your offspring now miss the target. And of course, if selection acts on your offspring to go and hit this smaller target, of course, in 10 years' time, that target shifted. That's what I mean about being the rock between a rock and a hard place. So if you like, this lovely adaptation to climate change, which is the norm, is no good if you have habitat loss as well, which is the new thing that we as humans have put in. And as you change habitat, you change densities of these migrants. And I showed you with the white throats, it's quite a shallow relationship. Here's a subalpine warbler relationship. It's actually relatively shallow. But subalpine warblers like trees in the Sahel, if you chop down the trees, you end up with fewer subalpine warblers. So here in 1993, northern Nigeria, Watchakol Forest Reserve near Nguru. 1993, we had lots of acacia niloticas, lots of subalpine warblers. Went there 8 years later, and we've got fewer trees. We've got fewer subalpine warblers. Not unexpected. And much worse than this sort of general habitat degradation, this shrinking of the targets, if you like, which is bringing the migrant populations down, migrants depend on a chain of habitats. So it's not just what's happening to habitats, say, south of the Sahara, it's what's happening to habitats all along the chain of migration. And if you get degradation on any one of those links in the chain, then it will affect the survival and the population of those migrants. And the best example we probably got a very, very large population crash of whitethroats in the mid 60s, end of the 60s, when the drought kicked in the Sahel, the last major drought in the Sahel. Things got better in the 90s, but then it was really grim. Whitethroats fuel up on Salvador Persica, just south of the Sahara, and then use that to fuel themselves over the Sahara. They arrive in April, feed on the berries, off they go. But of course, in drought years, Salvador Persica don't produce berries. So the whitethroats turned up, the berries weren't there, and literally half the European population didn't make it back because they tried to cross the Sahara because then they didn't, that's all they could do. And they didn't have any food resources. And actually, whitethroats probably don't use this strategy anymore. They tend to, at least what we found when we tagged the whitethroats in central Nigeria, is that they're not fattening up south of the Sahara. Basically, that habit was selected out, I would say, in the mid 60s. So any population, what this means is that any population in Europe, they migrate down and they spread out over a wide distance. So any reduction in habitat quality will reduce the population size. So why are migrant populations numbers going down, even though they're brilliant and adaptive? It's death by 1,000 cuts. We're just chipping away habitat here, habitat there, more people, fewer habitats, and it draws down every single population. Because remember, any change that happens in Senegal is going to affect all these populations. Any change that happens in Nigeria is going to affect all these populations because the populations spread out so widely. And then this takes us to a broader conclusion that, remember how I started this, saying that Palearctic migrants, these Europe-African birds, they're African birds. So these are African birds that are declining. So are they unusual in that they're declining? And I would argue no. I'd say they're only unusual in the sense that these are the ones that we count, because they come to Europe where we have hundreds, thousands of ornithologists mapping and counting birds. Whereas in Africa, we have very, very few. I'm talking to a sizable percentage of active ornithologists. And so the decline, as Africa's habitats are degrading, so the African bird populations are declining. And it's just, we are noticing it in the Europe-African ones. If we counted everything else properly, we'd notice the declines as well. So what do we do about it? And I should just finish up briefly talking about that. Well, we need African land sharing solutions, not just protected areas. Human population change is happening on a massive scale in Africa, and it's not localized to any one particular point. I mean, there are urban clusters, and even where you have urban clusters, they need a large rural area to provide the food for them. So you've got increased habitat change and so on. And conservation normally is, well, let's make nature reserves. But you've seen what the migrants do. They spread out everywhere, and they like, they don't like specialist habitats. They kind of like the general habitats where humans are as well. So there's this conflict. So we have to make space. We have to have land sharing solutions for migrants. A reserved area is good because some migrants will always find their way to the reserve. But actually, if you want migrants everywhere in Africa as they are now, you need to have land sharing solutions. So what are the barriers to this? The barriers are pretty much cultural in the sense that nobody quite realizes the consequences of their actions and how dull, desperate life will be in the future if we keep on just chipping away at habitats. Death by 1,000 cuts, you suddenly wake up one morning and you pass that threshold and you don't have these species there anymore. So we need ornithologists, we need ecologists, we need environmentally aware people throughout the flyway. We've got lots in Europe. We've sadly got many, many fewer in Africa. When I first came to Nigeria, 1993, there was only one person that I knew of who was an ornithological PhD. He was just finishing his PhD, Gus Azealia. He's been involved in apiary through the uh, through the years. Um, Now there are many more um, trained people. A lot of that is to do with apiary. And so we have a chance to change the culture, to change people's conversation about how they use the land. Okay, I'm farming, but I'm also thinking about wider ecosystem services, including biodiversity, including migrant bird species. Capacity building is really, really crucial. This has been my response to, thinking about how we can make the world a better place for the birds that I love and that you love as well. And it is like a drop in the ocean, but we're making a little bit of a difference. You know, the stories of lots of the people that are on the screen here, apiary graduates that have gone on and done things and are now significant people within different countries in Africa, making a difference, whether or not they're leading NGOs or teaching or doing research. And that didn't exist before. A fantastic range of destinations. Again, you're all familiar with it. Um, some of you may have seen a version of this diagram before, but I've updated it. Now, this is the number of papers that with local authors, so homegrown papers from Nigeria concerned with ornithology. And you can see that the number of papers has grown through the last 4 decades, although it only, there's a slow rate of growth in the second decade, and apiary was founded in 2002. So apiary starts to take an effect in the second decade here. And then we've got the third decade, now we're in the fourth decade. And look how the number of papers has increased. Now, obviously, less than 100 papers means nothing, but it's an index of what's going on. I haven't looked at papers to do with conservation. I haven't looked at other stuff. I've just focused purely on ornithology as my index. And the red line there is papers that are associated with apiary. So you can see that the whole Nigeria trend is being driven by what's happening at apiary, the alumni that we're producing at apiary. And the blue shows the rest of West Africa. That's our control. And yeah, things have got a little bit better. And actually, some of it getting better in the rest of West Africa is to do with us and what we do at apiary. And look at it now compared to Europe. So Nigeria is in red. And if we do it, we use a log scale because, I might as well lie with statistics and make it look a bit better. You see that Nigeria has jumped from West Africa, where not much is happening, to Europe. And it's overtaken Greece. It had overtaken Greece last decade. And now Nigeria has nearly caught up Belgium. So feel massively proud. It's entered, if you like, the Premier League in terms of ornithology, and it's going up. You can see how in Europe it's kind of like leveled off in the last 3 decades for almost all countries. But Nigeria, look at the rate of growth. It's really good. Anyway, thank you very much for listening.